Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Steel Division Normandy 44 for our Tuesday tutorial. So, doing another one of these because this is the game I'm playing, and I can't really do a tutorial for a game that I don't play because then I don't really know what I'm doing. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the combat phases and what's so important about them. I think that to a certain degree, this is really what defines factions and how they can properly perform, and it's one of the best differences from Wargame, in my opinion, and it's also one of the better ways of doing this, in my opinion, than in Company of Heroes, which sort of relies on the same principle, but does it in a much more clunky and ridiculous manner. Because, you know, if you look at the phase up for like one faction and see what they get when they phase up, and then look at what another faction gets when they phase up, it's very, very disheartening, to say the least, depending on who you're playing as. But in any event, we're going to be looking at a particular match here where I'm playing against the 116 Panzer Windhund Division, and I'm playing as the 3rd Canadians. Now, on the face of it, you might say that the Windhunds are actually an early game faction, whereas the Canadians are a late game faction based on the requisition points that you gain in each of these phases. But there's actually a lot more to it than just that. And while generally speaking, ones that get 100 points in the early game or more points in the early game typically are more leaning in that sort of part of the game, there are other sort of factors that go into deciding whether or not a faction is early game or late game. The 3rd Canadian Infantry, despite getting a ton of point requisition to throw loads and loads of Canucks at the enemy in Phase C, is actually a very early game faction by most people's standards. If we take a look at them, what makes these guys really good in the early game is their ability to push forward and take ground in that early game. They've got the Ram 2 tank, which is the second best tank in the entire game in Phase A. The only other one that can sort of compete with it is the Butte Firefly. So if you're not up against 12th SS Panzer, you've got the ability to have armor dominance. You can push against enemy armor with relative impunity because this thing is going to outduel any of those other tanks in the early game. The only thing that you have to watch out for, of course, is emplaced tank anti-tank guns, and you can sort of go around them or sort of avoid them if you know what you're doing. The other thing that they've got are the stormtroopers, and these guys are better than any other Phase A assault troops in the game. If you actually take a look at some of the other factions, they have got really good assault troops like the airborne engineers or something like that, and those are also early game factions. That's also an excellent early game unit, but the stormtroopers don't really necessarily need their grenades like the other factions need their flamethrowers or their hand grenades. These guys can just chuck their TNT bundle at an enemy and wipe that unit off the face of the map because it's got a very, very powerful area of effect. It's got very, very powerful explosive damage, and it usually just wipes out a unit in a single shot. Whereas the flamethrower, if the enemy actually has a leader there, what they can do is actually fall back all those units that are under the effects of the flamethrowers. Instead of surrendering, what's going to happen is their units are going to retreat, and then they'll rally eventually. Now, if they don't have a leader, then the flamethrowers are just as good or better than the stormtroopers because the opponent will surrender and then give up. So it's effectively killing them off. But with the stormtroopers, you don't have to give a crap. You're just guaranteed to cause the enemy to instantly die. Very, very good for training against very expensive, powerful units in the early game. Makes it hard to take those sort of more elite units that a lot of people tend to get. And if you're up against something like, say, Osttruppen or something like that, these guys shred through Osttruppen at short range. Look at that. 9 high explosive power from 2 different types of guns, both of them with accuracy 9. Yes, the range is very short on those, but there isn't really anything else in there that can fire at 18 high explosive power with 9 accuracy at point blank range with 2-star veterancy. If you get a rifle leader near behind these guys, they've got like 3-star veterancy, and they will be absolutely just mowing down whatever the hell they happen to be near. So very, very powerful unit in the early game. And even in Phase B, the only problem is that the Canadians don't actually have these guys in Phase B. By Phase B, they're relying on assault pioneers, and these guys run into the same problems I was mentioning earlier. They've got weaker guns, and they've got a flamethrower, which is weaker than the fragmentation dynamite that these guys are using. They've also got access to Phase A kangaroos, and this is an extremely powerful transport by contrast to most other ones. Not only does it have a very good heavy machine gun, 800 range, making it just as good as some of the in-placed German ones, but it's also actually fairly durable with 4 front armor. There aren't very many personnel carriers for any squad in the game that's got 4 front armor, making these things ridiculously durable for an infantry push against light vehicles or against things that are otherwise going to sort of try and take these things out. And speaking of that sort of thing, they've also got access to the Humber Mark III, which is absolutely amazing at shredding through the enemy SDKFZ half tracks. So There's a whole bunch of different things that the Canadians have going for them. The only thing that they don't have is a good infantry support gun phase A. But if you look at their entire roster, these guys look like they're just designed to dominate the game in terms of pushing forward in phase A. But if you sort of transition further and further into the phases, you'll notice that it sort of peters out in terms of their infantry options by phase C. By then, all you've really got are assault pioneers, and they're not actually that good. You can get a lot of them, sure, and yeah, you can get them with a ram kangaroo, which is actually a fairly high amount of firepower, but it's also, got 8 front armor. But honestly, it's pretty expensive for an infantry unit with a glorified heavy machine gun pillbox on wheels. By phase C, you're looking at nothing but fireflies, and the fireflies suck. If you're looking at anti-tank, certainly by phase C, you're relying on the 17-pounders holding up a defensive line there against enemy armor. And the general trend that you have to acknowledge is that there's sort of 2 different phases for every army. There's one defensive one and there's one pushing one. For the Canadians, phase A and phase B are their pushing phases, depending on who they're up against. Generally speaking, as the Canadians are going to want to take as much ground as possible so that you're scoring points by the end of phase B. And, you should be scoring points like all through phase A and then all through phase B. And then as soon as C starts, you have a little bit of ground. And as soon as this phase switches over to C, you switch to defensive mode. You switch to a defensive mindset. You bring out a whole bunch of these anti-tank 17-pounders. You bring out a couple of these Crusader AAs, which are extremely powerful anti-aircraft things. And, you sort of button in with whatever infantry you've got left and sort of just flood the field with whatever tickets of infantry you've got remaining. Because you're not going to be able to push that effectively into late game armor or late game units or late game anti-tank defenses. It's simply difficult to do unless you've got a real advantage as the Canadians in terms of having killed off a lot of your opponent's units. So you're trying to win the game as much as possible in phases A and phases B. We're going to take a look at the faction that I was playing against for our example in the other one. And now these guys are the 116th Panzer Windhund Division, and they're an armored division. Unlike the Canadians, their phase A, they've got plenty of sort of spy troops, and they've also got access to things like the SPW. I actually really don't like this because you only get 2 for a card. They've got sort of only high instead of very high optics, and they've got while their guns are pretty decent, they're nothing to write home about. So while people do take these, I don't really advocate for that. I don't advocate for taking the SPW 234s either, and then certainly not the veteran one, because that's a lot of points and you only get 1 for the ticket. So I definitely prefer taking the spy troops because they've got the optics at very high, and that is really one of the biggest difference. And they come with an SDKFZ 250/1, but in any event, my opponent there, I think he had some slightly more grenadiers than I had, but you'll notice that they've got these very, very high veterancy grenadiers, who are extremely, extremely expensive, but extremely good. The problem with this is that if you end up in a fight where they're exposed to something, they get obliterated. You can't lose your Panzer Grenadiers in the early game as the 116 Panzer. And when you get into phase B, you're looking at larger stacks, sure, but these guys are no longer the veteran ones. They're a lot worse. So what exactly are you hoping to do in phase B? Well, you can sort of start flooding the grounds and try to sort of put your troops into a position where you can push back, but these guys aren't pushing troops. You have got access to the Pioneers, but the Pioneers are coming in fairly smallish groups there. So while these guys are going to be wiping out enemy infantry if they sort of come in contact with them, if you're forced to push into a strong defensive position that or someone who's also pushing into you, then this is going to be a little bit difficult. And look at the cost of these guys. They cost 50 points because they come with the SDKFZ 251/1. Now, part of this is because the Pioneers come in a 10-man squad, but you're not looking for the statistics that these 10-man squads come with. You're looking for is just one simple thing: this high explosive frag grenade value from the Gebalte Lading. So the fact that these guys cost 50 points, whereas the Canadians would only be paying 20 points for their shock infantry, well, this means that these guys kind of don't trade very effectively against them. If you lose a Pioneer for a Stormtrooper, that Stormtrooper cost a lot less than the Pioneer did to take onto the field. Now, yeah, you'll have a half-track running around, but that half-track's going to be like just Humber bait. So you could instead take the Stern Pioneer, of course, but again, that runs into the same sort of problem. And you could even run into that bigger problem where your Stern Pioneer runs into a unit of, say, Stormtroopers, gets blown up, and the Stormtroopers don't surrender because they've got an officer nearby. So you end up not only having lost the Stern Pioneer, which costs 30 points, and then 50 points if you actually count how much you had to call in it with, but, that's still going to be a loss at a pretty big way. Now, these guys don't have any sort of infantry that differentiates them going into Phase C. So, they're not an infantry deck. That's basically the takeaway as far as that goes. But the infantry that they do have isn't really designed to be able to push forward very easily. It's designed to support the tanks very effectively. A bunch of Panzer Grenadiers sort of running around, making sure that Sherman doesn't ambush one of their tanks, and sort of taking the ground that the tanks push through. And also clearing up room, and since they're in larger units, they can also absorb a lot of fire. Once they get to these sort of B phase Panzer Grenadiers, they're actually pretty good for absorbing fire. But it's the tanks that really sort of make these guys what they are. And if we take a look at these guys, they are one of the most focused on Phase C factions in the game. In Phase A, we're looking at the Panzer IIIs, which, okay, that's appropriate, I guess. In Phase B, we're looking at the Panzer IVs, but Panzer IVs are not necessarily super great or anything like that. You'll actually see Panzer IVs getting outdueled by the Ram, so we're still not able to see an armor push that easily in Phase B. But Phase C, look at all these Panther Gs I can have. I can just have as many Panther Gs as I want. They don't even cost that much. 280 points for something like this is nothing. So these guys are extremely, extremely good, especially if you can get them within command radius of, say, like a BEF Panzer IV that I've had loitering around in the back line for a phase there. You see the sort of normal stuff for the Phase A support stuff. I honestly don't find the Flame Panzer to actually work very well for me. I mean, theoretically, on paper, they're quite good. I should probably actually take the Grill, though. 1,000 range, very high power explosive, can sort of dislodge people from buildings, but again, it's so fragile that you can just run an SDKFZ up towards it, or sorry, not an SDKFZ, you can just run a Humber up to it and it'll kill it, so. But yeah, they've got the ability to take lots of these half-tracks, very, very effective for their cost. They will get wrecked by certain things, but when you've got enough of them, they work out really, really well. For anti-tank, you're looking at a faction that, again, starts off really weak, and then you get into Phase B and you're like, you could take a couple of these 75 millimeters, but they sort of run into Phase C and they suddenly get a lot of these Pack 43s. I should actually get rid of the Jagdpanzer and take one of these instead, because honestly, this is probably a much better anti-tank gun, actually. For anti-air, you're looking at very, very limited options there, as typically you should be. They have got actually really good artillery. It's surprising that I didn't see my opponent using Panzerwerfers, because the Panzerwerfers are actually really, really good. And then they've got good, decent call-in artillery with the 173mm field artillery. And then they've got the Wesp, which is pretty good. And then in Phase C, you've also got the Hummel, which I think is usually just not really necessary. Also got the Nebelwerfers, but since you've got the Panzerwerfers in A, I typically don't particularly think you need to rely on the Nebelwerfers by that point in time, since hopefully you haven't lost your Panzerwerfers. If you've lost them, then yeah, that kind of sucks, but that's a different issue there. And then for air tab, you've kind of got the same sort of thing going as the Canadians. Very limited air tab, not necessarily all that good, but it does what it's supposed to, and it's kind of okay for that purpose there. So what I think is actually really, really weird about these guys is that they've got an A phase 2-star Messerschmitt 109, and then they got a B phase 2-star Messerschmitt 109. Both of them only come with one Messerschmitt 109, so why the B phase only gets one instead of getting two or whatever is a little bit weird. As the other option, of course, you're able to get the ME-109 Go, and it's non-veteran at all, and it's a worse plane. So I've never seen anyone really take these things. So I don't know. I'd have to actually check to see if they're any good. But what ultimately do we learn from this? Well, these guys have trouble in both A and B phase, but they've got a much more dominant phase C, simply because of the Panther G, and to a lesser extent because of things like the Junker 87 being able to shred through enemy tanks quite easily. But that's something you could pull out in Phase B. It's a bit risky in Phase B. By then, hopefully, you've got enough SDKF Z7/1s, which I think are the superior anti-aircraft as compared to the Mobile Wagon. Maybe the Mobile Wagon's better. I honestly don't have much comparison, but I find the fact that you can take so many more SDKF Z7/1s compared to how many mobile wagons that I don't really like these things. So it's hard to say, maybe one or maybe the other, but in any event, yeah, so hopefully by then you've sort of built up enough of your forces, you've got enough of your infantry still alive that you can perform a counter push, with the armor being sort of like a spearhead and being support for it, because these things are extremely powerful. If you keep them like far enough away from bushes and trees and stuff like that, and you sort of scout out bushes and trees so that you can call in Nebelwerfer strikes or Panzerwerfer strikes against it, then these things can sort of roll forward with impunity, because you'll have that sort of artillery dominance with the Werfers, being able to clear the way for these tanks to move forward without fear of field guns, and if there's enemy tanks nearby, then nothing's going to stop a Panther G. But you've got a real risk of being pushed so far back in Phase A and Phase B with these guys that you're going to be really regretting it. So how do you avoid being pushed too far back? Well, these guys have got fairly strong tools for defense in Phase A. The SMG-42 with 2-star veterancy is extremely good as a defensive unit. For support, they've got plenty of these SDKF-Zs, which are a little bit better on support, I find. Since if you're drawing the enemy forward, you can definitely hit something like a Humber with a PaK-38, and that works out quite well as far as that goes. And their infantry, of course, while rare in numbers, are quite effective when the enemy does get in range of them. You just have to make sure that these Panzer Grenadiers are able to use that ridiculous amount of Light's MG-42 damage, and are not getting pinned down and then annihilated by a Stormtrooper, because if you're letting that happen, then they're definitely not able to use their advantage to their fullest. So I think that you sort of defend in a few key important locations and use the fact that you've got these very powerful machine guns with these guys to sort of give you sweeping arcs of fire across very large areas to defend in that early game. And if you can defend that early game, avoid that sort of early pushback, then you're going to be in a great position to sort of roll in with your Panther Gs in the late game and just sort of crush the enemy in that sort of sense. And as well, if you're in Phase A, you know, if you've got a couple Panzer IIIs lying around in early phases, these things are actually quite formidable in early game. It's just if you're running up against a Ram that it's going to run into trouble. So that's, you know, if you're up against something like, say, a Cromwell, these guys can actually duel a Cromwell kind of okay. If you're up against other sort of early game tanks, like the French early game tanks, the Char M3A1 or whatever, M5A1? I can't remember which numbers it is, but a Panzer III can actually take those guys out pretty well in the early game, defending you against those early game armor pushes, depending on who you're up against. It's really just the Canadians, ironically, that these guys struggle at defending against. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the particular match that I played, and we'll have a sort of look at how that dynamic works and why it's so important to understand that. Alright, so here we are on the battlefield, and you can see over here I've got my 3rd Canadian Infantry against Gonvaroviv 71, using the 116 Panzer. And we've got ourselves this weird village map. Now this does slightly, in my opinion, favor the Canadians, but if you're not actually going to fight over this village, what you can do is actually just have a couple recon in a few important locations in the city, and then just Panzerwerfer the ever-loving crap out of it. And just sort of surround it with SDKF-Zs to make sure that no one can actually leave the village alive. And then just keep pounding it with artillery until everyone in the village is dead, in which case it's kind of a net loss for the Canadians because they've lost so much stuff in there that it won't be worth the points tick that they've gotten, because all you'll have spent is supply. And it's always okay to spend supply if you're going to dislodge and kill a large number of people. So anyway, you can see that my opponent here has got these sort of very powerful elite troops. And he's actually buying a couple of support units that I would not consider personally getting. But because his units are so much more expensive than mine, he's only able to bring in a very small number of points to this battle by contrast to what I'm able to bring in. I know that when you're up against the 116th Windhund Panzer, you can actually ignore anti-tank to a certain degree. I've not ignored it completely. We've actually got 3 of our anti-tank guns, but it's not like I brought a ram tank, which is a much more dedicated expenditure, because it can only be really in one place at a time, and is just if you're absolutely certain that you're going to be up against a crap ton of tanks. Plus there's lots of really good sight lines for anti-tank guns in this particular map, so that's kind of why we're doing this. Let's slow this back down here. So I'm able to sort of push forward very quickly to get into this position in the village, and my opponent is kind of making a mistake here in that he's contesting the village with his very, very powerful high veterancy Panzer Grenadiers. And this is a mistake because they don't necessarily excel. They don't get to use their additional attributes. They're what makes them special and what makes them extremely powerful inside villages. My rifles are kind of spreading out throughout the various alleyways and choke points of the cities on their side, so we're starting to get a points tick right away against these guys to a certain degree, and we're just setting up in multiple locations. Now we've actually got stormtroopers posted up fairly early in a forward position here, and I actually have them in the wrong place here. We're getting some other stormtroopers pushing up along this flank over here, though. And they're in a much better spot to actually properly attack my opponent. The reason that this is a bad spot is that it's easy for my opponent to get a bunch of units along this sight line here, and I can't sprint these guys forward to attack my opponent across the street because of that. Just retreating some rifles here, it doesn't really matter. Now, if my opponent had done things a little bit smarter, he would have actually gone for this forest here along these prongs, because these provide good long sight lines across a wide area and gives him a good sort of defensive posture to defend some support guns, like anti-tank guns and what have you. And he could have also focused a couple defenders along this area here looking through this way, because this is a very, very difficult area to defend from the side though, so I can't really blame him. But you do have to defend it, because look how much points drain he's taking from this area here already. So we're able to push forward with our rifle leader, and we're taking a ton of fire, but it's not really doing very much because we are actually in buildings. What he should have actually done is suicide push forward with the flame panzer if he wanted to use it. For some reason, like my rifle leader actually gets spotted there and gets instantly wiped out. I'm actually very surprised at how quickly it died, but you know, 3-star Panzergrens, or 2-star and a 2-star STKFZ, so that's how that is. Panzer III runs in, and I've got plenty of anti-tank guns, so he can't really advance all that far. We managed to crew knock out the SPW, and that's about it, unfortunately. I was hoping that we'd kill this thing before we got killed. I kind of figured we were in a position where we were definitely going to get killed, but not really a big issue. Like I said, I'm not too worried about armor pushing around this area. I actually bring up a Kangaroo with some infantry in it because I am actually worried that he can just run some Panzer Grenadiers or something like that straight down this line, and there's nothing I'd be able to do to stop him, which is absolutely true, but there's no way that he could have known that, so it's just something that he has to sort of be aware of. Over here, I could have pushed forward. I didn't realize this was so lightly defended because it's such a natural point for the 116 Panzer to defend. But in any event, Humber getting back into the fight here, able to start firing away, and knocks out one of their vehicles. My rifle's still just holding the line here. The whole point of these guys is to sort of stay there, and even if they're taking huge amounts of damage from this building being shot and filled with bullet holes from high-caliber machine guns, they're still doing their job quite effectively. This SDKFZ 250/7 is being a real nuisance, though. So we got a couple of rifles. They're just taking turns being pinned down. This is giving lots of time for my Humber Mark III to sort of like fire off every single shot from its munition loadout there. We've got like a unit of Panzergrens actually pinned down here as we fire away. And we're actually getting some crossfire from these rifles up here from their Bren gun, which is absolutely crap because the Bren gun is a piece of garbage. I should have actually been targeting specifically with the Humber against this SDKFZ, and actually I should have actually been doing it against the Flame Panzer, but whatever. We actually end up getting pushed away by the SDKFZ 250/7. But you can see that I've got a very successful early game push here. His tank sort of stumbles forward into a very bad position. This is what I was saying about those these 6-pounder positions. Very, very good 6-pounder positions to stop him from being able to actually reinforce this line with tanks from this side, and this is why this is such a bad side to try and defend from. It's much, much better on this side of the map, but at the same time, this area to push forward required my opponent to be a little bit neglectful. If he had done this a lot better, he would have actually had his setup here so that I could barely push up to these two prongs here, whereas on this side it's sort of the opposite. He's got that prong and he's got that prong they can sort of defend across here from, so he simply let me push too far forward on the side that I should have actually had the disadvantage. Able to get off some shots with our 6-pounder here. We're getting sort of shot at along here, but I think actually it's the Humber that takes this thing out. You can see actually a burst coming down from that Humber, and just sort of pops that thing. Spy troops end up like opening up right in front of these rifles here, and those rifles are able to wipe it out pretty easily. Over here, you can see like these cheap rifles are just able to sort of soak up the attention and firepower from my opponent. And it's not like they're actually there to kill enemies. They're just there to simply be there, basically. SDKFZ 250/9 coming in to challenge for my Humber, and it's actually a pretty good answer to it. In all honesty, I should probably be getting out with this thing. I think it actually does like retreat itself. And it's also almost out of ammunition. It's been firing like non-stop this entire battle, basically. Oh shit, I actually killed it with Humber. Okay, that's hilarious. Still, this very, very veteran, very important Panzer Grenadier, like, has been sitting here soaking fire from these rifles and from all this other crap for forever, and it has not really been able to do anything, and it dies. This is an extremely premium, expensive... Oh, I did lose that. It's an extremely premium and expensive unit, and he can't afford to lose that sort of unit in this fight. Like, I'm sacrificing much, much, much cheaper units. So Storch forced to fall back by the Spitfire Mark 9. I kind of got sick of its shit. My opponent has finally come to the realization he's going to need some anti-tank. I've got a ram coming forward, actually, at this point, but... yeah, Storch just, like, is so slow that the Spitfire ends up, like, dramatically overturning to try and get back on its 6. There we go. Down goes the Storch. Crashes, like, right beside some of my infantry, but they're unfazed. They're stormtroopers. They don't give a shit. But yeah, like, my opponent here has, like, got virtually no control over some of the places that he should really be controlling in this phase of A, but what this is allowing me to do is sort of really reinforce my position. It's letting me sort of get my units' sort of numbers up in sort of the key areas, and honestly, like, yeah, sure, I don't have necessarily that many riflemen or that many stormtroopers on the field, and they're sort of like the bread and butter cheap infantry, but I haven't really needed them. Every time I add in more of these units, it becomes harder and harder and harder for him to push forward against me in later phases. And this is all I have to do, is just sort of hold the line here. I'm getting a good +2 tick. But at the same time, I'm looking for areas to exploit a gap. I'm looking for moments to push forward against my opponent here, because if I'm able to push forward against this and get a more solid grip, if I can make sure that I'm getting like a +3 tick going into phase B, it doesn't matter if I start dramatically losing in phase C. And I have to sort of compensate. I have to assume that I'm going to be getting my ass absolutely kicked by phase C. Because if I don't assume that, like, what happens is he takes over like 100% of the map basically and gets a +4 tick in phase C, then I can actually still lose or draw a battle that I had this much map dominance in. Like, I've had games where I've had more than this amount of points in this point in time that I've lost or drawn because my opponent was able to lock me down in a way that was really kind of gross, actually. So this is why we're seeing like more of my support guns being pushed in. We're seeing just a little bit more infantry coming up to support the areas that I think are a little bit weaker. And why we're seeing, for example, this ram tank, which is just able to sort of make sure that we're able to keep our gains for this phase and going into phase A and phase B. And my opponent is doing the exact wrong thing. He's pushing units into areas that I have got locked down with my defenses. Like, if he was aiming for this gap, that would actually be a different story, because he could actually do a lot of damage moving through this gap here. Able to fire off a shot against this SDKFZ, and I miss, because I miss a lot of my tank shots in this match. Able to push forward with the Humber. The Humber is unfortunately going to get killed by the Panzer Grens, gets bailed out and then killed. So that's actually a worthwhile trade, though, since the Humber is basically free. It comes with my Recce, which I'm going to be getting anyhow. Although, admittedly, Recce would be a lot cheaper if I didn't have to pay for the Humber. In comes a Panzer III, so I'm going to lose one of my Bedfords with a unit of rifles in it, unfortunately, because I wasn't paying attention to the pathing, but, you know, that's fine. So yeah, that Bedford goes just down in one go, and then out comes the Stormtroopers from the other one. But, you know, whatever, rifles, they're pretty inexpensive. At this point in time, anti-tank gun dueling with a Panzer. And yeah, like, these things are weak. They don't really have the ability to fight back against me. They're not really going to dominate against a 6-pounder. I, like, screw up my deployment of these Stormtroopers, and I should also have, like, my... actually, no, I should actually have a new unit of command infantry over here. But even though I've, like, fucked up my movement with these Stormtroopers, they're actually shred through, like, a couple of these guys before they start losing the fight. They've actually killed, like, 4 of these guys. What I did is I accidentally moved these guys away just at the cusp of them throwing their bundle, so... I pulled out before I could blow my load, unfortunately, which you should never do. Or wait, you should always do? I forget. What's one of the two? Getting pinned down by these Flame Panzer 251s. I'm able to chuck the smoke, though, and I'm able to get these Stormtroopers into the right building, and they're able to throw their bundle at these Panzer Grens and wipe out the unit. So this is why Stormtroopers are so good. 20-point unit. Basically just took out a, like, 50-point unit by themselves. Super, super effective. I managed to get some shots off against these other guys here, but I think at this point in time I realized like I can just walk my ram into here and kill everything, because there's literally nothing here that can oppose the ram. The Panzer III kind of can, but not really. I think over here we've lost a couple things to this. Actually, no, we haven't lost that yet. I think we lose like a Wolverine or something like that there. Get in position with our 6-pounder over here, and it starts firing away at the SDKF Z250/10. Manages to kill it. Pack, unfortunately, just in the middle of the road. I actually realized that this is an unsupported pack now that I've killed the SDKF-Z, though, so I just walked stormtroopers right up to it. So I figured if there was like a 50 cal around here that it would have opened fire on the rifles already, so I had a clean run for my stormtroopers. So this was a mistake by my opponent having an unsupported Pack 50 or Pack 38 here. Seeing some artillery firing, but I'm already moving away with my 6-pounder. So just want to make sure that the field has as much anti-tank as possible, so that no matter where he goes, even if I'm pushed back, I've got anti-tank guns in place. I just want to make sure that no matter what happens, my opponent isn't going to be able to push back against me when it comes to Phase C. So here comes the ram. I've just got attack moving in through this bush area because I know there's a buildup of armor here. And we take out a Flampanzer. The Panzer III sort of is looking at something and then realizes that, oh shit, there's a goddamn tank rolling in on all of this stuff here. And we sort of have our different units on a different moves, but he has to turn a corner before he can fire at me, so I'm able to get that first shot, get his unit shaken up a little bit. And what happens a lot of the time is that for some reason when your stuff gets shot, it sort of actually moves around a little bit, like the pilot automatically redeploys a little bit, so this gives me time to fire even another shot there. And we wiped out that tank pretty easily. Here I sort of like dump everybody out of the Bedfords before my opponent can do anything, but those stormtroopers took out that enemy tank. He's trying to back people away from my ram, which is sort of advancing here. Kills their mortar, but the thing is they can't back out because there's a 6-pounder firing straight like down their ass this way. So if we take a look at our sight line here, it's exactly just capable of seeing anything trying to retreat from the ram. So that's fantastic here. Ram's going to push forward again. He's trying to bring in some more infantry, and this is that premium infantry there, but we're still in Phase B. He still doesn't have a great answer against something like a ram here. At this point in time, he does have access to the Panzer IV, but the Panzer IV is not actually a good answer against the ram. It's barely an answer against the Sherman. It will beat a Sherman, and it is cheaper, but it's not a great answer to it. Here we're popping a bunch of their tanks. 6-pounder is able to open up and take out the SDKF Z250/9, if I recall correctly. Maybe not now, but at some point. Humber Mark III gets wiped out because the Pack 38 gets some support there. Able to bring in a couple Spitfires up against this Messerschmitt, so that's going to be helpful, and then we're able to do a bombing run afterwards. I think the Pack 38, though, does kill my Wolverine, because Wolverines are useless. I don't really remember why I had it here. What I honestly should have done is just saved up for another Sherman. And here we're just pushing forward with our expendable infantry. Like, just through sheer numbers, we're able to get a push forward here. Which isn't necessarily normal for the Canadians in Phase B against these types of units, because he should actually be able to push forward again with these Pioneers as a counter push. But unsupported Pioneers just sort of get wrecked because they've got the I've got the ability to support my guys with things like the Ram, tank and stuff like that, and other vehicles and the Shermans and stuff like that. Here comes that Panzer IV I was talking about being an effective sort of a cost. I would say they're actually cost effective against Shermans, since the Sherman 3 is more expensive, and they kind of are 50-50. You're typically going to see like the Panzer IV being just as effective as a Sherman 3. Getting a couple shots off with our 6-pounder and unfortunately missing against these SDKF-Zs. If I had actually scored a hit here with that, that would have been brilliant because it would have popped the unit along with the vehicle, so that would have been really, really nice. Unfortunately, I don't have a leader here. I should have just brought up a dingo. So here you can see, like, I have actually, like, forced this to fall back, and we still haven't hit the damn thing. This other one here, we finally get the ammo explosion. Panzergrenführer, though, on the ground. Panzer IV here turns around and starts firing at my Ram. The Ram is actually good enough to beat typically a Panzer IV because I got the 1-star veterancy, and that hit, therefore, does mean that we bail out the Panzer IV. So it's not a great thing to try and duel with the Ram, but it is a good idea to duel with the Sherman. Now, the thing is that the Panzer IV comes in much larger numbers than the Ram, so you can outnumber it, and you can outflank it and stuff like that. But if the Ram is able to get onto you, in a straight-on fight, then it does have a pretty big advantage there. If you've got one of the 2-star Panzer IVs, though, like a lot of people do, then it does actually have a good advantage against the Ram. And you can see that it's not really actually that effective at killing this thing. It's pretty okay at it. Look at all these non-death crits that we're getting. Ridiculous. Bounce. Over here, again, we're seeing the effects of like Pioneers trying to push forward without having access to like vehicle support or enough supporting fire. And it's getting like annihilated by the high explosive shells from the Sherman, where it should be easily able to roll over these rifles. It can't, and that's because if they keep trying to go forward, what's probably going to happen is they're going to get more easily pinned by the Sherman and the Canadian fire before they can close to 100, because the Canadians will start opening up their small arms rifles as well as their Bren, and what's going to happen is these guys would have gotten pinned down at a much closer range and then forced to surrender. Panzer III again. Panzer III is actually firing away at some of my infantry over here. And this is what he should have been... Like, if he had this before, what would have happened was, like, all my guys would be pinned, all his guys would be pinned, and no one would be getting anywhere, because the tanks would be taking the infantry out of the equation until someone could win the tank fight. Or if he had better supporting weapons. Here we're able to push forward with some rifles, just walking to a Pac 38. I can't believe it took me this long to realize there was no infantry defending over here. And I don't remember, but I think we might even lose the Sherman here. Oh, no, we don't. Okay. I don't remember doing anything else with the Sherman, though, so maybe that's just it. So, yeah, like, this is that early game advantage being really extreme. My opponent at this point in time has got, like, 3 units on the entire map, and I'm getting a +4 tick. But, you know, this is what I have to do to win the game, is to get my opponent so far on the back foot that he has no hope of victory. And otherwise, you know, he's going to grab that hope, and like a dog grabbing a bone, and he's going to just King Tiger me or Panther G me in the late game, and I'm going to lose then. So that's kind of how this game works right now. It's understanding the phases, understanding when you're stronger, when you're weaker, and, you know, just really hammering forward with those advantages and disadvantages. Look at how pathetic the Sherman is in terms of taking out this Panzer III. I fired all these shots at it. It is like a Sherman is a much bigger tank and much more impressive tank than a Panzer III. Ram comes in fighting another Panzer III and just like one-shots it. I don't know, man. In comes another Panzer IV. Sherman can't keep up with the Panzer III. It's retreating, backing away from it. This is just sad. Sherman, do some damn work, Sherman. General Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman, whatever. Panzer IV misses its shot against me. I miss my shot against him. I converge my shots from my Sherman over towards the Panzer IV because it's a much bigger threat than the Panzer III, so I want to make sure I focus fire on it first. We miss again with the Sherman, and we again get a kill with the Ram. The Ram took 3 shots to kill that guy. Panzer III, I think, ends the game alive. Miss again. Slowly bring that gun around. Miss again. And yeah, this is why when I say that Sherman's not actually that good a tank, it's really not. And I think the game ended just before that could explode. So yeah, let's just take a look at one of the more impressive things in this particular match. This Ram 2 is now, I would assume, an ace, a tank ace, but it has taken out an SPW 234/3, a Flame Panzer, a Panzer III, an SDKFZ 250/7, a 251/1, a Pioneer unit, a Flame Panzer, a Panzer IV-H, a Panzer III-M, and a Panzer IV-H. So I'm pretty sure that qualifies this guy as an ace. But yeah, suffice to say, like, what we were looking at here is my opponent failing to sort of understand what his strengths and weaknesses were in the early game. He deployed those Panzer Grenadiers in a place that allowed me to sort of use my superior short-range shock troops, and he didn't recognize the sort of importance of keeping them alive in Phase A. He didn't really have support guns in the places that they needed to be, and it meant that he lost the game before he could get to that Phase C power spike, where he would have actually been able to sort of roll back all of my advances and destroy all of my units and so on and so forth. By contrast, I really did know what Canada was all about, and I knew that by Phase C, if I ended up in Phase C, I'd need to start spamming out the 17-pound guns, because that would let me build a defensive line that could potentially hold back some of those Panthers. Because, you know, even if your opponent's charging forward, if he loses a Panther or two in the process, that means that he has to wait until he can afford another Panther and a bunch of supporting units before he can try another push forward. So if you're in a position where you're scoring points and you've got a position where you can get a good focused fire and just sort of throw that at the enemy, then you can hold the line against that sort of thing and survive through Phase C. And then if you can survive 10 minutes of Phase C without losing your ground, even if you get rolled back in the last 10 minutes of the game, then you should still win on points. Even if you're on like just the barest threat of life by then and have only like a trickle of -3 points or something like that, then you're still probably going to win based on points by then. And that's sort of how you have to play this game, is understanding when you're going to have the advantage and when you're going to have the disadvantage. Now, you have to be a bit careful. There are certain Axis factions that actually are early game. Fallschirmjägers come to mind when I think of that, and they're very, very good in the early game with their extremely powerful infantry. And to a certain extent, I think the 716 infantry are also very good. So while generally speaking, the Axis factions are better in the late game and worse in the early game, there's still some exceptions to that. And honestly, like the 12th SS Panzer is one of those sort of weird exceptions where they're actually really strong in every phase of the game. The only reason that they're so strong in every phase of the game is that they've actually got a pretty large number of Panzer Grenadiers, so they don't actually have to babysit their infantry as badly. In Phase B, they can spam out loads and loads of Pioneers because theirs don't come with the expensive half-track vehicles or something like that. They've got the Butte Firefly at the start of the game. They've got the Tiger E in Phase B. They've got the Tiger E and the Panthers in Phase C. So they're able to roll you over in terms of tanks and so on and so forth once that happens. The only things that they really lack in is they actually have a very, very bad air tab, and they've also got a pretty bad artillery tab, in my opinion. Like, they have got the Phase B Panzerwerfer, but I honestly would think that these guys would be so bullshit if they had access to a Phase A Panzerwerfer. I'm really glad they don't. So yeah, like, there are some exceptions. The way that you beat these guys is to recognize that despite the fact that these guys have extremely good units, they get bled dry really fast, so that kind of is how you deal with these guys. And they come in low numbers, so you just sort of gang up on units and wipe them out that way. But yeah, it's kind of it's one of those ones where it's just like, typically speaking, I would say that the really strong factions are the ones that are strong in every phase. To a certain degree, like the Canadians actually are pretty strong in every phase of the game. The only phase that they sort of fall behind in is Phase B to a certain extent, and that's only against certain people, and that's only because they don't have access to the really good anti-tank guns in Phase B, and they don't have a really great tank in Phase B. So they're really relying on their defensive positions and gains from Phase A, but if they don't have those, they're kind of boned. To a certain extent, I think that the French are actually pretty good throughout the entire game. They're not as good throughout the entire game, so I think they've got some issues with that. A lot of people like the 101st Airborne. I actually think they're a little bit weak come Phase C, by contrast to a lot of others. But if we look at the Axis, it's the same sort of thing goes for them. I've been seeing a lot of Luftlanders lately, but typically speaking, I think that the SS Panzer are one of the strongest divisions. And I think that the Luftlander are one of the stronger divisions to a certain extent, Fallschirmjägers. And all of these, to one degree or another, are really good through all three combat phases. What makes the Fallschirmjäger good is that they actually have access to so much ridiculously good air power that they don't actually have to win a tank battle to win the game. They just simply have to make sure that you don't have access to really good anti-air and air dominance, and if they can avoid that situation, then they're going to be fine. And they almost always win the air battle thanks to the Flak 41s there, giving them access to some pretty bullshit suppression. And once your airplanes are suppressed, the Me-109s just come in and just clean goddamn house, and they're very, very good for that. I should actually get rid of one of my other planes in favor of yet another. Actually, I could even get rid of something else in favor for that, but not only that, but they have got actually a 75mm anti-tank gun that's actually pretty credible, especially considering that 13 armor piercing is more than enough to take out most of the allied stuff. access to things like the landwehr in Phase B lets them have a fairly cheap infantry option to sort of defend a lot of the gains they gain from Phase A very effectively. So yeah, like the Fallschirmjägers actually are good throughout the entire game. Phase C, like their armor lacks a little bit, but like I said, they don't have to win the armor game in Phase C, or just roll forward with armor in Phase C. If we look at the access as well, Luftlanders, to a certain extent, like they've also got these really cheap units that sort of let them flood terrain and sort of get boots on the ground in a lot of areas, very fast, very early. And then once they've sort of got that land, they can sort of defend it really effectively with these very cheap and effective anti-tank guns. And then they've got the infantry support guns. I actually have a really suboptimal Luftland deck since I don't personally use them myself. I just use, if I really feel like going something along this route, I actually prefer playing as the Fallschirmjägers. But these guys sort of have the same feel and sort of same theme as the Fallschirmjägers to a certain extent. They even have a gigantic air tab, because these guys basically are another airborne group, so able to sort of just flood the field to sort of push forward and defend with the addition of the SMG 34s here, which I can't remember. I think this is a 500 range. Oh no, this is one of the 800 range ones. Okay, so either way, very effective machine gun there for holding a defensive line. But yeah, that's kind of the way this game works. Figure out what faction you want to play as, figure out what phases you should be pushing forward in, and then figure out which phases you're supposed to be defending in. And if you really want to be cheesy, pick a faction that is capable of being dominant in all three phases, like the Canadians, or like the 12th SS Panzer, or like the 101st Airborne, or like the Fallschirmjägers, or something like that. And yeah, you'll probably be doing fine. So anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.